Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest European Parliamentary Research Service Book Talk. As you know, we have a series of book talks during the course of the year, and they vary from academic books about European politics and European integration, through to historical manuscripts and often political diaries, which are an increasingly attractive source of record. And David Harley, the former Deputy Secretary General of the European Parliament, is going to talk in this book talk about his own record, Matters of Record. This is the book, Inside European Politics, Matters of Record, the Diaries of David Harley, 1992 to 2010. And it's not his first book. He produced a novel a couple of years ago called Sidetracked, which was published right at the height of the Brexit crisis in the United Kingdom, and told the story of how one man took on the dark forces of the state to save his country. Not entirely clear that that was the outcome of that particular Brexit crisis. But in this book, David traces back to 1992 and then through to his retirement from the European Parliament in 2010, some of the highs and lows of European politics. And it's rather reminiscent of another great British diarist of the European Union, Roy Jenkins, President of the European Commission, who wrote in his European diary that what was fascinating about Brussels was the extraordinary mixture of great issues and petty intrigue which the city embodied. I think the petty intrigue has largely been excised, if I'm not mistaken, from David's account, but it is actually a very nice and rounded political history of Europe during those two decades. He, of course, worked in the Parliament from before then. He was in the cabinet of Henry Plum, and he was advisor to the then Secretary General of the European Parliament, Enrico Vinci, before becoming Director for Press and Media and spokesman for the President of the European Parliament, serving as Secretary General of what was called then the Socialist Group in the European Parliament, and then finally as Deputy Secretary General. And to comment on and maybe ask one or two questions of David, we have the current Secretary General of the European Parliament, Klaus Welle, joining us. Klaus, of course, is previously Chef de Cabinet of the President of the Parliament, was Secretary General both of the EPP party and of the EPP group in the European Parliament, and guides us as an administration through the demands and the challenges of modern European politics, not least the last year and a half of the COVID crisis, which is why, of course, this particular book talk is being conducted entirely digitally. We hope to get back in due course to the library reading room, but for this time we're doing it online, and one of the advantages of doing it online is, of course, we have a bigger and broader audience. David, tell us a little bit about the book, why you wrote it, what messages you wanted to communicate, and how things in retrospect perhaps seemed a little bit different to how you remembered it when you went over your notes of that period.
Organising this talk, and thanks also to Klaus for finding the time in your busy day to come here and exchange a few reminiscences perhaps, and thoughts, pointers for the future even, as we look back in order to understand better what happened before, in order to move forward perhaps even more effectively. Why did I write these diaries? Well, to quote the mountaineer, partly because they were there. They were gathering dust, 64 little red notebooks that I had in a box in the attic. And just over a year ago, I went through the box and the notebooks, and I said that should I throw them away, or shall I send them off to Florence, or shall I just see if there isn't some material here for a book? And so I started putting them in order and taking out what I thought were, writing up the most interesting events and themes of that time. And slowly, the book seemed to take on a life of its own. And I managed to, I think, try and write it at several different levels. That it's about events, the great events of that period, which included noticeable advances for European integration with the single market, the single currency, very important period for the European Parliament's own development and the development of its powers and competencies. And then in terms of foreign policy and external relations, the transatlantic relationship between the US Congress and European Parliament, and between Europe and the US more widely were all very much affected by, first of all, 9/11, then the Iraq War, and the aftermath of all that. So there were events to look at, and there were also themes that were running through that period as well. Obviously, the events and the themes are kind of mutually significant, and also there are a few stories. So that was the first sort of reasoning that I had in trying to put together these diaries. But also, I'd always, rather like what you just said, Anthony, I had also read the Jenkins diaries, and of course, I would have liked to have put more juicy intrigue into my own diaries, but I just couldn't remember any, and so that didn't happen. And I didn't either put in as many references to good lunches as Roy Jenkins did, which is very much a feature of his diaries. But I like the diary form. I think it lends itself to writing up a chronicle of a period of history. And very much in tune with your last question, as you actually write a diary, you don't always realize sort of what's happening and what the developments and the trends are. And it's only when you put it all together and you look back, then you can see that there were some very interesting things happening. For example, I don't want to dwell too much on the British sort of subplot of this book, but I personally hadn't realized during all this time how much Tony Blair wanted to become president of the European Council. It was only when I went back and I saw the number of times at every single meeting or otherwise, when he sent a minister to Brussels, they were actually sending us that message. But as we know, it didn't quite turn out as he had hoped. And in addition to the events, the themes, the stories, there were also one or two memorable quotes that I wanted to put in. And I think the most famous quote of all is the one which I'm afraid to a family audience or the EPRS book talk, I can't really repeat. I assume that you haven't had a previous case of using the F word on one of your book talks. So I'm going to say it in Italian. Instead, this was the remark from Pat Cox to Berlusconi in the lift after the Schultz incident, when in Italian he said, "Silvio, che cazzo hai fatto?" So that was one memorable quote. And Pat told me when I sent him a copy of the book, he said, well, not only did he definitely say that, but behind him in the lift was Manservisi, Prodi's chef de cabinet, who as soon as he heard these words rushed down to the Italian press. And it was on the front page of the Repubblica the next day. Another juicy quote that I liked, that a bit more obscure, was the remark from the Lebanese politician and socialist Wally Jumblat, said, when I was Minister for National Unity, I tried several times to shoot the president, which is an unusual thing to say. And then we had a couple of very interesting visits to the Baltic states when I was with Pauline Green in the Socialist Group. And we felt then the great nervousness of those three countries in terms of their future relations with their neighbor Russia. And Leonard Mary, who at the time was president of Estonia, was quite a famous film director. He came out with a quote, "You can't turn an old Democrat into a young colonel." And then Landsbergis, who later came to the European Parliament, who was the leader of the Lithuanian independence movement, said, speaking of the difficulties of dialogue with Moscow, it's very difficult to discuss interparliamentary affairs with somebody who thinks the world is flat. But if you agree, both of you, if I can ask your indulgence, I thought I might just do a couple of readings from the book. First of all, to give you a flavor of the mood in Europe, and in particular in the EU institutions in 1992, which is the first year that I cover in the diaries, and was also the year of the Expo in Seville. So here goes. Among those representing the EU institutions in Seville tonight, there is an unmistakable feeling of optimism in the air. Europe's economy is booming. The triumvirate of Kohl, Mitterrand, and Delors provides strong and enlightened leadership. Economic and monetary union is now a reality. The single currency will soon be jingling in our pockets, and the Soviet Union has collapsed, thereby opening the way for enlargement to the East and the reunification of our continent. The daring architecture at the Expo, epitomized by Calatrava's soaring bridge, the milling crowds, pavilions from all over 100 countries from around the world, pulsating music and dance, families and young people out to have fun. And then for us Euro nerds, the imminent launch of the internal market planned for January the 1st next year, and the accompanying legislation, which had been the subject of our discussions today with Felipe González and his principal ministers. Everything seems to be coming together for Europe at the right time. The magenta sky of the setting sun over the Guadalquivir, next to where Columbus first set sail for the Americas, recalls William Wordsworth's words of passion and excitement at the time of the French Revolution. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. Now, anyone who is a follower of thrillers will know that when you have such a note of optimism and positivism, this is to indicate that quite soon things are going to go badly wrong. However, we had another 10 days later, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth addressed the European Parliament with the most pro-European speech that I think anybody has ever heard from a British representative in the European Parliament. And then 10 days after that was the first negative result of a referendum in Denmark. So I chose 1992 as the beginning of the book because it was the annus mirabilis for the EU, but it was also a moment when British attitudes to Europe were at a high. Now, moving swiftly on to 2003, June 2003, I'd like to read out a description of an official visit that Pat Cox paid to Paris, and particularly when we move on to lunch at the Elysee. Chirac comes across as good-humored and approachable, and has a gift for putting everyone at their ease, despite the ornate surroundings. I'm honored to be seated on his left. On the institutional questions, Jacques Chirac produces the striking phrase, "We don't need one big tire and one punctured," meaning that there's no point in strengthening the Commission and weakening the Council, or vice versa. In welcoming the moves towards a member's statute, he recalls his time as an MEP for 9 months in 1979-80. His recollection was that when the newly elected members arrived in the European Parliament building for the first time, instead of being shown the chamber, they were directed to the cash office, where they would be handed an envelope stuffed with 500-franc notes. So he understands that reform is necessary and overdue, and Cox can count on his full support in bringing forward the necessary reforms. After the main course, coq au vin, accompanied by a delightful Romano Conti from 1990, we're just starting to relax when Cox tells the president that he will be visiting Washington the next week. Chirac immediately lets forth with a stinging and clearly heartfelt condemnation of US foreign policy, the main thrust of which goes as follows. The current administration, says Chirac, is the most reactionary in US history. This isn't a criticism, it's just a fact. Transatlantic relations are essential, as we're linked by a common culture and shared ambitions. But since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Europe has no longer been strategically important for the US. The Balkans conflict masked this change. Now the US has made it clear that it no longer needs Europe, and its unilateral policies have provoked a dangerous reaction against the US and the West in general. The main objective of US foreign policy is now to break up Europe. Kwasniewski, the president of Poland, is a former communist, has helped them in this objective. The Russians felt humiliated and they won't forget. We mustn't be like a small dog that blindly follows his master wherever he goes. I have a very small dog, says Chirac, called Sumo. He's both affectionate and extremely independent, and I respect him for that. On the way out, Chirac says that the other day he told Nicole Fontaine that Pat Cox is the first president of the European Parliament that has won the European Council's interest and respect. Madame Fontaine n'était pas très contente. And now we move on to what was possibly the most exciting 24 hours that I spent in my career in the European Parliament on the 22nd and 23rd of June, featuring Chancellor Schröder and Prime Minister Blair. On the 22nd of June in Aachen, the long-planned dinner takes place in a somewhat soulless private room in the Park Hotel in Aachen with Chancellor Schröder, Martin Schulz, and José Manuel Barroso, whom Schröder calls Mr. Barolo at least 3 times during dinner, plus one advisor each. Schröder's in a bad mood. He's particularly rude about Blair, whom he calls untrustworthy and unprincipled, völlig unanständig, among other epithets. Those earlier happier times when die neue Mitte complimented the third way are long gone. Schroeder has a lengthy charge sheet against Blair. Not a true European, too much siding with Bush on Iraq. But what seems to rankle more than anything is the unscheduled visit that Blair paid to see Angela Merkel when on an official visit to Berlin some 10 days earlier. On a human level, I have some sympathy for Schroeder, who is trailing behind Merkel in the polls, almost certain to lose the election in September. He already has the look of a lame duck chancellor, and worst of all, he knows it. The next day, Tony Blair addresses the European Parliament on the forthcoming UK presidency. He comes from a third successive election victory, although with a reduced majority. Despite his record on Iraq, perceptions in certain quarters of the UK's lack of commitment to the European ideal, in the chamber today, Blair takes on his opponents and comprehensively wipes the floor with them. I hope for his sake that Schroeder wasn't watching. Some memorable passages. I am a passionate European. I always have been. I believe in Europe as a political project with a strong and caring social dimension. I would never accept a Europe that was simply an economic market. There's no division between the Europe that needs to succeed economically and social Europe. The purpose of social Europe and economic Europe should be to sustain each other. It's time to give ourselves a reality check to receive the wake-up call. The people are blowing the trumpets around the city walls. Are we listening? Have we the political will to go out and meet them so that they regard our leadership as part of the solution and not the problem? The ensuing standing ovation is well deserved. If only he would occasionally make such passionate pro-European speeches back in the UK. So if I could add, perhaps, before handing the floor back to Anthony, and then with great interest listening to what Klaus may have to say. Another reason that I had for writing these diaries was that I wanted to make a modest contribution to improving understanding of the European Parliament. Many people, some former colleagues, other great academics have written remarkable books about the European Parliament, but too often, in my opinion, a little bit too much jargon and too many acronyms. So I wanted to try and bring the European Parliament to life, to show that it's not a kind of self-contained spaceship flying around another galaxy, or and that the charge of the EU institutions of being full of faceless bureaucrats, all that is just the stuff of the tabloid press and quite untrue. All of human life is in the European Parliament. And the same processes and dramas that happen in national parliaments happen in the European Parliament as well. So I felt to try and show that human side, to describe how it was for an official, in my case, a very fortunate official, to have had such a rewarding set of responsibilities and jobs. This would show the human side to working for the European Parliament. And I felt that the diary was the best way of trying to get that message across. So there you go.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Extremely interesting and a beautiful scene setter, if I may say. And those passages are very powerful, and there are many others. I'd strongly recommend to anybody who's watching this to try and acquire a copy. It's not as easy as it might seem, apparently. Acquire a copy of this book, because it has some beautiful aperçus of the what you might call the haute politique of the European Union, as well as being written with great political sensitivity and understanding of the significance of what's being described. Now, before Klaus Welle joins in the conversation, I just wanted to remind all of those who are watching, we're almost 100, that you can ask questions of David either through the Q&A support function to communicate with them under Q&A at the bottom of the screen on the right-hand side, or in the chat function. And I will try and take as many of those questions as I practically can towards the end of the discussion. But over now to Klaus Welle, the Secretary General of the European Parliament, who I know has been reading the diaries avidly. Klaus, and thank you so much for sparing the time, as David says, to join us.
Yes, thank you very much, Anthony, and also thank you, David, for, in fact, this contribution you made. I would like to say the following. The key question is, of course, for many in our audience, why should you read this book? And I would like to give a couple of arguments why, in fact, this is time well spent. First is, this book is deeply entertaining and even funny. And that's already more than can be said of 90% of this kind of publications. So if you take the time to read through this book, I think you will have a good time, you will enjoy yourself, and it will be entertaining. You will find lots of what non-British people call British sense of humor, which is one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why we are regretting Brexit so much. And that British sense of humor, in fact, has to rely on a very subtle form of intelligence, which is here at full display. I also think we have to acknowledge that David, by writing some of these parts, took considerable personal risks, especially when he disclosed the exact mixture of the drink of Her Majesty the Queen. I didn't find before that, in fact, to lighten herself up, her drinks consist of 1/3 of gin. But if I read it correctly, that's exactly what David is saying. And he's also unveiling what's the other 2/3. And we know, therefore, that she is in the good tradition of her family, which led her mother to a life which clearly crossed the 100 yards line. I'm saying David took personal risks because I don't know whether this kind of indiscretion has an impact on his future abilities to still be knighted in the British system. I could imagine, but he chose to share this information with us, and I think that's very good. In fact, David wrote a diary. The structure is the structure of the diary. So logically, David is telling us many stories. But within the many stories, which are happening on precise days, we can also identify some common stories that go through the basically 2 decades he's describing. And some of them, I think, have an important lesson for us to be told for the European Union. So for me, one is that in fact, this is a permanent struggle. You have the high points, and once you think you are there, you are immediately thrown into the next hole. In fact, we have the internal market, and then the different Irish referendums, and then a negative referendum on Maastricht. But for me, the real lesson out of this is that what we always need is resilience. It's not that it's difficult just right now. The truth is, it has always been difficult. It has been difficult in every decade. And it has never been more difficult than like in the 50s, when other people had to pardon the Germans for the atrocities during the Second World War and beyond, and be ready to establish a true partnership. Nobody needed more courage than the French and other partners in those times. And if they had that courage, I think it is fair to ask some courage from us as well when times are getting a bit tougher. We can also see that political fortunes are changing all the time. So David starts his book with a description, let's say, of the heydays of the Labour Party, especially in the European Parliament. 62 seats, which did not only guarantee more or less the dominance of the Socialist Group, but also a very powerful role in the European Parliament as such. We are taken through the years of Tony Blair, but then also finally to moments of defeats, not only in European elections. So we see that things can turn for the worse, but that also means that we can be confident that things can be turned around for the better, not only in Europe, but also in individual countries, because fortunes are changing all the time. And therefore, I think we can be confident also about the future in moments of distress. We can also see very clearly the limits of every strategy, whatever sophisticated it might be. At the time, it surely looked like a brilliant idea to introduce proportional representation in Britain, as David has described. Britain was finally accepting that it should align its electoral system to the European Union. But what it also did, it provided a very strong organizational platform for UKIP. And the pressures that finally built up through proportional representation, through the European Parliament, on the British political system, I would argue, led right away to the pressure on the referendum, and finally on Brexit. So we see that whatever strategical talent might be around, the unintended consequences are never to be forgotten or denied. I think David shares with us in his book also some clear examples of bravery. He describes his monthly meetings with John Hume, and he says very clearly that this engagement for peace in Northern Ireland meant that he risked his life. He put his own life on the line, and he also informs us that at least at the time, London and central government was heavily uninterested in peace in Northern Ireland and in the activity that John Hume was conducting, which finally led to success, peace, and also the Nobel Prize. So he puts in front of our eye how a single man can make a difference if he's ready to risk it all, and if it's the right moment to go ahead. I think we can also learn in his book how dependent the fortunes of the European Union are on national politics and personalities. And in fact, when you read his book, you see this permanent change between the life in the EU institutions, European political parties, national political parties, governments, government leaders, changes in government. And this is the only appropriate approach, because the European Union is a union of citizens and states. It doesn't have a separate life from the fortune of its member states. It doesn't have a separate life from what their citizens wish. And citizens make themselves heard, but also leaders either are up for the moment or they are not. In critical moments, they are either ready to take their responsibility and give the difficult message at home and fulfill what I call the elevator function, which means bring that additional capacity that is needed at that moment in time to the European Union level, even though this might be difficult and even endanger their own careers. And I had earlier on, now more or less 30 years ago, the chance to accompany these efforts of Chancellor Kohl in Germany with his readiness to adopt the euro, to integrate the Deutschmark, which was far from popular, to say the least, in Germany, but paid huge dividends for European integration. I regret to say that in Britain, we have seen that there was also the question, are people ready to go out there and take a political and personal risk for their own popularity? And unfortunately, I feel far too often the answer to this has been no. And therefore, the surprise of the referendum result was rather, how is it possible that after 30 years of shying away to properly explain, and how is it possible after 30 years of the tabloid press trying to tell every bad story about the European Union that's around, that still more than 48% voted for yes and for remain? We also see in David's book the divergence between speech and action. David has described, and he has also read to us, the speech that Tony Blair gave to the plenary at the starting point, or just before the starting point, anyhow, in conjunction to the UK presidency. I regret to say it, but I've rarely seen such a huge divergence between a speech, which was probably one of the most brilliant speeches and giving us hope for a major change, and then the final outcome of that presidency, which failed, among others, to deliver on the multi-annual financial framework. I would also like to thank David for the honesty with which he's describing not only his role, but also our role. Because what is our role? Our role is a bit of everything. There are moments of high politics, which David has described, especially also his more political role as Secretary General of the Socialist Group and with the Labour Party. But there's also simply to assure proper administration so that members can do their job. And then there's also the very, let's say, down-to-earth service, like pouring the glass for the Queen. And finally, there's also these moments where our functions give us the right to show and the possibility to show our humanity, like in the moment when David chose to not ask the old lady, which had smuggled herself into the dinner or lunch with the Queen, to leave the room because she was not entitled, because he very well understood that a dream of a life had come true and that the risk of leaving her at the table were extremely minimal. Last but not least, I would also like to thank David for describing myself as the dynamic Secretary General. I hope I'm still fulfilling that description, and I would like to thank him also for the confidence he has shown and that has established our relationship as Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General at the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Klaus. And David, would you like to come back and pick up on any of those themes which Klaus has been exploring? Also to ask you a very particular question left sort of pregnant from your own comments and those of Klaus, which is, did you, in your book here, you say that that you poured the glass for the Queen, but you don't actually reveal whether or not she drank it. I was discreetly instructed to leave on a shelf over the basin in the royal bathroom in case Her Majesty might need a fortifier before entering the parliamentary chamber. I try one myself in a separate glass naturally, mixed with 2/3 Dubonnet and 1/3 gin. It has quite a kick, but it is a little sweet for my taste. It seems to have the desired effect on the Queen, and then but it's ambiguous as to whether she actually consumed it.
Anthony, my bravery that Klaus has so kindly referred to has its limits. And there are certain things, because of my loyalty to Her Majesty and the Palace, that even at this late stage, I cannot reveal. I leave it to your imagination. But I would be surprised if after I had mixed it precisely as I had been requested, and given the spirited rendition of her speech, I would be surprised if she didn't even have 2 glasses. But anyway, who knows? I'm afraid that is a mystery. There are limits, as I say, to my bravery, but not to my discretion. Klaus, I'll have to send you a very long letter to thank you for all that you said and the interest that you've taken in the book. And I was quite proud of the book before, but hearing some of your comments on it now, I realized that in fact I've underestimated the importance and value of the book. Very few points that I disagree with at all, or that I don't totally agree with. I'd just like to, as you mentioned, John Hume, first of all, sadly, his wife Pat died 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she was a tremendous support to him and very important figure in her own right in Northern Irish politics. And among the memorable quotes, I mean, John did have the habit of quite often repeating himself. And one of the quotes that he often repeated was that the trouble with the British is that they never remember, and the trouble with the Irish is that they never forget. And I think we see that a little bit today. In fact, there are so many of these points and the themes in my book, not least in transatlantic relations. I mean, we could have a separate sort of session on that. And is there a line to be traced from 9/11 through Iraq and the financial crisis and Trump? And each time in each of the stages in the development or deterioration, I would say, of EU-US relations, the situation becomes more complicated, and we're now into a new and possibly the most difficult chapter of all in some respects. But again, as Klaus so correctly said, the answer to this is to put the premium on resilience. There was actually, I read an article recently in the German press, but I sadly can't remember the name of the journalist, who talking about Angela Merkel's attachment to identifying the center of gravity in her management of European politics. And in the same article, I think it was the journalist rather than Chancellor Merkel herself, who made the point that centrifugal forces are an intrinsic feature of the European Union. There will always be, in a community of nations of 27 different countries, there will always be a lack of perfect agreement on everything. And there will always be certain member states that will want to go their own way, will have a different take on things. And so exactly as Klaus says, we will just be buffeted from one difficult issue to another. But the genius of the European Union so far has managed to bring together these different countries with their different political traditions and cultures. I agree as well with the link between introducing proportional representation, PR, in the UK, which let in UKIP for the first time, even though then there were only 3 UKIP seats, if I remember rightly, in 1999. But certainly it was the beginning of a great anti-European movement, and a platform was given in the European Parliament for these people. But I still maintain the firm belief that Britain's withdrawal and the result of the referendum was never inevitable, but it was very badly managed by all the political parties. And for what it's worth, this is not the subject of our talk today, but I don't think rejoining is either realistic or a desirable objective. Britain has to work out what kind of country it is and where it wants to go, because it would be doing a disservice to the rest of Europe for Britain to suddenly try and join again. But we must nevertheless work from within the resistance from the inside to leave open the hope that with a future government and different political conditions, we can at least have a better relationship in terms of the economics and the trade and the rest of the values we can share. We can hope we can do that later. But there is no quick fix to this. Britain has a recent history of cultural confusion going back many, many years. And there's Hugo Young, who I'm sure Anthony would have read, and possibly Klaus as well. His book, The Blessed Plot, talks about this deep-seated problem of British cultural identity. And Shakespeare said a lot about this as well. I've always felt that when Shakespeare talked about this sceptred isle, this demi-paradise in the silver sea, he was actually taking the piss and being ironic. But there have been back and forth, to and fro, between insular and internationalism in UK politics, and at the moment we're very much into the insular trend, it would seem. So thank you very much again, Klaus, and I'm sorry I can't give a straight answer to Anthony on the Queen's drink.
Very understandable and very discreet. I'd like to remind those who are tuned in, we're now 99 such people, that you can ask a question or make a comment about David and the book by using either the Q&A function or the chat function, so please don't be shy, feel free to do that. I wonder if there's any further question Klaus would like to ask. He's very welcome to come in, but I've got one question I'd like to ask you straight away, which is that one of the features of this book, which doesn't, or put it this way, one thing that doesn't feature so much in the diary is very much on the internal politics of the European Parliament as an administration. There's a certain amount about the macro politics of the Parliament, and of course, especially when you were Secretary General of the Socialist Group. But you don't deal very much with the nitty-gritty day-to-day business of what it's like being a senior official and the process of keeping the machine moving. And I wondered whether that's because you had decided strategically just not to record it because it didn't particularly interest you or something, or whether rather it was to do with the fact that you felt that those elements that you had recorded wouldn't be of such interest to a general readership.
To flag up this point, because obviously I didn't spend my whole time writing a diary when I had important administrative responsibilities to carry out. I didn't lock myself away in my office and pretend to be dealing with the financial regulation when actually I was trying to write some funny story about Mr. Barroso. I spent 99% of my time, at the very least, doing my administrative job. But I didn't feel that would really. I couldn't see a way of fitting that into the rest. There may be a second book to be written, or perhaps you could write one yourself, Anthony. You've got a lot of experience as well of management. But if you have any idea, perhaps we can write one together. But the important thing is to try and keep it interesting, unless, of course, you just want to simply put on record the way things are done. But the best person of all to write about the internal workings of the Parliament would be the current Secretary General. So I think we definitely an opportunity for Klaus there, though I hope he continues in his current functions for a long time. There's just one other thing, actually, that Klaus mentioned, where I would like to sort of, don't want to give the impression that I agree with every single thing that you've said. I understand the point you're making about Tony Blair being a brilliant orator and not being able to follow up some of his brilliant rhetoric, and you make this little dig about the financial perspectives. You're kind of absolutely right in terms of the basic facts, but I think it sorted out fairly quickly afterwards. Was it with the Austrian presidency? I think considerable progress had been made under the British presidency, but they were playing they weren't playing it very straight, the British presidency, I agree, because they were very concerned about their rebate, as ever. But I think that he did bring everything forward. What I omitted to say, of course, when I talked about the 24 hours with Schroeder in Aachen and Blair in Brussels, on the morning of the day where we had this difficult dinner with Schroeder, Juncker was in the Parliament in Brussels, winding up the Luxembourg presidency. And he was absolutely livid with Blair for having obstructed a result on the financial perspectives under the Luxembourg presidency. So this was a big issue, and there was a lot of bad feelings at the time. So I'm not surprised that you felt that the Brits had not acted honourably. But I don't think that all blame should be laid at Tony Blair's door.
Thank you. We have the first question in, which is from Anna Caprile, who's asking or recalling the fact that Jacques Delors memorably said, Europe needs a soul. So how do you see the possibility of generating more of a sense of affection and emotional commitment to the European process, not only based upon your observation of politics, but also your actual experience as being the spokesperson for the President of the European Parliament, and therefore somebody very much in touch with and understanding the needs of public opinion? Europe needs a soul. How do we give it a soul?
Well, this, I think, takes us to what has been one of those eternal questions over many decades in Brussels and in the EU institutions. How do you communicate better the value of Europe to people's daily lives? I think Delors also said you can't fall in love with the internal market. And so part of the answer to the question of how to give Europe a soul is not to concentrate solely on the economics. You have to also give cultural activities as much support as possible, something that we're very much in the UK, this is turning into one of the major problems in terms of young people's disappointment about Brexit, is the difficulty for musicians and practitioners of the arts and cultural activities generally to carry out their activities at the moment following Brexit. So culture is important, but I think also I have a kind of hobby horse which relates indirectly, I think, to this question, and this is partly a political a position that I take as a proud European social democrat. I can say that again now that things are sort of moving in a certain direction in one particular member state. Kept it a bit quiet over the last few years. And that is, I think that there are pockets of inequality all over Europe that we really have to look at. And I don't understand why, I'm going to say this from the outside, perhaps I've been away for too long now, why there isn't a proper EU policy to eradicate these pockets of inequality, which led to the Gilets jaunes in France and to the rise of right-wing movements just about everywhere. And I think there is still an issue, and please correct me or take on this point if you disagree, Klaus in particular. There's still an issue about the EU being regarded as an elitist project. And we really have to get away from that. I mean, I take my share of responsibility, having worked, as you say, as the president's spokesperson, but also director in DG Com. We haven't done enough to involve people for whom the advantages of Europe are not immediately visible. And there was another quote that I could have mentioned of Pascal Lamy quoting Jean Monnet, the incredible quote, which is actually quite well known, that apparently Monnet said the people weren't ready at the beginning, the people weren't ready to agree to integration. So you had to get on without telling them too much about what was happening. But that was obviously at another time. And I'm sure nobody would repeat that or follow that line today. But there is still a lot more to be done to widen the base. I know you had great results in terms of the turnout in the elections last time. That's a very important step forward. But to give Europe a soul, we have to prove to people that the quality of their life will improve the more Europe is effective. Klaus, what do you think?
No, I would agree with David there. The key issue in communication, and that's what we try to address also during the last election, is that let's say European institutions like to speak about what they're doing, but that's not interesting from a citizen's perspective. From a citizen's perspective, the only interesting thing is what is the impact on themselves. So, and there I can thank again Anthony and his team that they prepared what Europe does for me. So what are we doing for people's dogs? What are we doing when they're unemployed? What are we doing if they like football or skating? So are we relevant for their daily life? And this translation work has to be done and is still too rarely done if we want people to understand what is the impact of the European Union on themselves. We also managed for the first time in the last election to really have hundreds of thousands of people engaged on the grassroots. So I think technology here can be a big game changer because it gives us the possibility to link up directly with people on the ground by providing them with material, with arguments, and then they organize themselves as they always organize themselves. Associations became active as well. So if we also see additionally that language technology, both for translation and interpretation, is getting really into a new quality that allows people to communicate directly, even if they don't speak each other's language, I think there is a silver lining on the horizon where to go. Soul, of course, is a difficult concept to see. There are some people who are not only questioning that Europe has a soul, but there are some people who are questioning that something like a soul does exist at all. It is already a decision to believe that there is something like a soul. But I think if there is such a thing as a European soul, it's very much in our convictions on democracy, on pluralism, on human rights. And if you don't feel the European soul when you're inside, I think you will feel it very quickly once you're outside the European Union and look at it and see the difference. There is something specific as a European identity, which we can also call European soul, whether we realize it or not, and people understand this once they're losing it.
Thank you very much for that, Klaus. Thank you very much, David. We have some questions and commentary, and Richard Corbett comments that the Monnet quote as he puts it, although often cited, is in fact an invention. He never said that. So the scramble's on to try and find out whether or not that is true. Richard Friedman asks a question. He's read the book, and he's I think affected by your entry of the 2nd of May 2004, Seamus Heaney's poem to welcome the 10 new member states. It's quite a moving section of the diary. What was your own sense at the time, and what's your sense now about the enlargement process, which you saw so very closely?
You will appreciate that I can't resist the temptation to go back to Richard's outrageous suggestion that I've invented this quote. But I was simply quoting not Jean Monnet but Pascal Lamy, so perhaps Richard could sort it out with the great was he president of the Institut de Law these days, who put out an interesting statement yesterday about their conference on the future of Europe. I saw very, very critical. So enlargement, I think, was the number one issue and priority for Pat Cox during his presidency. I was not in the little team of people that accompanied him around the applicant states, and I didn't have very much personal involvement. I did find it very moving sort of at the time, and as I say in the book, at the first meeting that we had when I had just been made Secretary General of the Socialist Group, the first meeting with the members from the new member states was a very moving occasion, and there were people there who had spent years in prison, who had really suffered under communism, one or two others who were not quite, we weren't never really sure exactly which side of the struggle that they were on, but nevertheless you did get a sense of this being a historic moment, and everybody was very optimistic. Now, looking back on things with the advantage of hindsight, again, I'm sort of helped by a couple of the meetings I attended and references that I make in the diary. One, when we went to Mrs. McAvey, I think became an MEP, when she was Minister of Justice. And I say in the book that after spending a couple of hours with her, it was absolutely clear to me that Romania was never going to fulfill the conditions in terms of the formal conditions and the rule of law and fighting corruption. But that the political stakes were so high that there's nothing you could do about it at that stage. And then the other memory that I have, which is also in the book, was a lunch with Madeleine Albright, but attended by Borislav Gerimek. In fact, I've got another as well. It's all coming back to me. Gerimek said that the EU and the Commission had put too much emphasis in the negotiations, in the accession negotiations, on economic and trade conditions, and not enough on promoting rule of law, independent judiciary, and civil society. And then finally, there was the moving occasion when Václav Havel came to the parliament shortly before his death, when he said, "Give us time, be patient, be patient. This has never happened before, that so many countries spent 60, 70 years under communism, and we're now in a completely different situation. We cannot overnight fulfill all your expectations, or indeed our own." Now, how we've got from that honest admission and the similarly honest admission from Gerimek to the situation that we see now, I'm not qualified to comment because I haven't been around in the institutions for the last 10 or 11 years, but it looks very worrying even from the outside. I don't know if you're able, Klaus, to say anything about the situation in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, any other member state that you care to mention.
Before Klaus comes back in, if he wishes to, just to say the opportunity is still there to ask questions. Please do so through the Q&A function or through the chat. One question that's been asked is from Olga Kosmidu, who asks, where is the book sold not by Amazon? I don't know whether not by Amazon is meant to be a statement or an injunction, because I know that it is available through Amazon. But if you'd like to acquire the book, not only can you find a copy in the European Parliament Library, but it's on sale in the kiosk/bookshop on the ground floor of the Spinelli building. Klaus, I don't know whether you want to come back on anything that David just said on the whole enlargement process and its aftermath.
Yeah, maybe just starting by saying that, in fact, I had my own experiences. I received in '91 also a delegation from Estonia, when more or less nobody wanted to see them in Bonn at the time still, because it was a hot potato, you know, and how do we position ourselves towards independence, and what's the consequence for the Soviet Union and for Gorbachev. So in that sense, let's say I've also seen all the different phases. I think the debate which we are having now is centered around different components. Definitely about the rule of law, and the Commission has taken action there, very much also encouraged by the European Parliament. I think there are also question marks about corruption, which goes hand in hand, about the reduction of checks and balances in a vibrant democracy, which is not just the rule of the majority, but also the rights of the minority, and not just the rights of minority at a certain moment in time, but really free media, free press, diversified political ecosystem. All these questions are legitimate, correct, and are raised and are followed. Below this, we have another issue where I think we have to be a bit careful, and that's more a cultural issue. If you are a union of 27 states and 27 people, you have to factor in that culturally, where people are coming from, you will have different backgrounds and different convictions, and you need a certain tolerance to accept this. Let's remember, for example, that when it came to Ireland, for a very, very long time, in fact, basically up to the referendum where they changed, Ireland had different views on abortion, which was not very acceptable for the rest of the European Union, but it was tolerated. If we look at the United States, we see that within individual states, between, let's say, the West Coast and the Deep South, there are very, very different convictions on culture and how people should live together. And I believe in a federal union as the European Union of that size and of that magnitude, we have to understand that not everything can be centralized, and that not necessarily this is something, and this is, by the way, why this is not a European, let's say, legislative priority or competence, that we will see a certain number of divergences between different member states. So that's where I would place it. And when you have been living 40 years under an authoritarian and totalitarian system, that has effects. And in fact, we are not just speaking about 40 years. We had the time of the war, and we had the interwar period, which was also a very difficult period for many of those countries. So there are issues to be addressed, but we also need a certain tolerance and understanding for cultural diversity, and that always goes in both directions and not only in one.
Thank you very much for that, Klaus. David, I don't know whether you want to come back on that or anything else that Klaus said. We'll then take another question.
Very finely balanced. Like, yeah, that's fine. I was just saying that what Klaus said is very finely balanced, so I have nothing to add. Right.
Excellent. So we have a question here from Stefan Reynolds, which is about the consequences of Brexit and how you believe they will play out for the European Union. I mean, we talk a lot about the implications of Brexit for the UK, but what do you think the likely trajectory for the EU is now without the United Kingdom, and how big a difference does British departure make?
Well, I'm grateful for the question, but I'm not terribly well placed to answer, because I'm a little bit out of touch with what's happening in the European Union today. It was frequently said at the time, immediately after the referendum and the decision on Britain's withdrawal, that this would actually facilitate a lot of business in the EU institutions, and particularly, for example, on the recovery plan. It was considered very unlikely that if Britain had still been a member state, that the British government would have supported that plan and the principles behind it. So I think in many respects, in terms of the day-to-day business, it's not all bad news. Then could facilitate things for the management of the European Union. You will know better than me, both of you, how majorities have shifted and changed somewhat. The British emphasis traditionally on the single market and indeed on the free market was a trait that was supported by certain member states who no longer can count on a major member state having those views. So there has been a shift in that respect. Frankly, although I'm grateful to Stefan for the question, there are so many problems created, in my personal opinion, by the current British government that affect the UK internally, that I find it actually quite hard to focus on the consequences for other countries. And I was amusing myself waiting for us to go on air today by reading an article about gas pipelines between the continent of Europe and the British mainland. And this is yet another example of where nobody had predicted that there could be a gas supply crisis in the UK and the need to kill 70,000 pigs and I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of turkeys because of lack of CO2. This is not directly because of Brexit, but it's the internal energy market in the rest of Europe that Britain is no longer a member of. So I fear we're going to go through a very, very difficult period, and also given the ideology of the current government and the ineffectiveness of the opposition. But I promised myself when I started writing the book that I would not write it from a British point of view, and I wouldn't write about Brexit. And so I must kind of bite my tongue to some extent. But I would like to think that there are positive results of Britain leaving for the rest of Europe, but that's for others to judge.
Thank you for that. If I may, I'm going to slightly take advantage of my role as chair to ask you a further question, which is now with the perspective of a decade or so outside the Parliament. How would you, if you had completely free hand, how would you reform the internal procedures and processes of the plenary in particular, which you observed, of course, extremely closely in particularly your latter job, your last job? I mean, what changes would you make to ensure that the plenary was more effective as a forum for the expression of views and a platform, in effect, for the communication to the European public of the mission and role of the European Parliament as an institution? Because, as you know, there's been a whole debate about this, and indeed there is a reform process going on right now in the European Parliament with one or two changes being proposed, which will be introduced very shortly. But the key question is, why doesn't the plenary make more of an impact? And what would you do if you had free hand to encourage it to have some such impact?
Incredibly difficult question, as you know, and I'd be interested to learn about the reform process that you refer to that is currently underway. I mean, what strikes people coming from the outside, perhaps the first thing that strikes people is the lack of speaking time that members have. And it just seems, pretty strange that people can't speak for 1 or 2 minutes. This was, of course, again, something that was actually instrumentalized, or weaponized, one might say, by the Brexiteers, and particularly by Daniel Hannan. It was part of my job as the Director General of the Presidency to stick around for these explanations of vote when everybody else had gone off for lunch. And you had all the Brexiteers and the UKIP people. And Daniel Hannan, he got something like nearly 100,000 hits every plenary. because he knew how to use the technique and the rules of procedure for his own ends. I'm afraid all I can say more seriously in answer to your question is something that I proposed many times, and for some reason it never really happened. And I, again, take my own share of responsibility. And perhaps it is happening now. What I always wanted to see was a press release coming out at the end of each plenary detailing the benefits to people's daily lives of the decisions that have been taken in the plenary that week. And I don't know if it happened, and I don't know why we don't do it. And I tried, and somehow or other it got mixed up. And I think, there are always in communications, or there used to be tensions between the Parliament Secretariat and DG Com and the political groups. But at the end of the week in Strasbourg, people kind of, as much as Strasbourg continues, people are no longer sort of interested. But that's the most important thing, the result. Whether the result of all these deliberations and these committee reports that have been in the system for months and months. So what happens now? And of course, there is another story, it's vaguely coming back to me now, of the implementation of these decisions, which the Parliament, forgive me, Klaus, sort of some grandly thinks that this is the end of the process sometimes, or the members may think that, and they sort of pat themselves on the back if they're a rapporteur. But then it the legislation enters a kind of murky space, and often the result on the ground in certain member states does not bear total resemblance to the text that was voted by Parliament. So I would look at that end of the process, as well as how to deal with the nitty-gritty of the rules of procedure internally.
I mean, on the latter, of course, there has been quite a bit of progress, not as much as there could be, but there's been quite a bit of progress in the last few years since you retired. And the number of implementation reports which are done by parliamentary committees has been growing. And that's been very much supported by the administration. I mean, both to encourage, particularly at the first year or so of the parliamentary cycle, when there's not so much new legislation coming through, give committees more opportunity to do that, encourage them to think about this. But also we've created, for example, in my own DG, we have a unit called the Ex Post Evaluation Unit, which supports committees in drawing up these reports and does implementation assessments and so on. And so it's moved from, I haven't got the exact figure to hand, but it's moved from a situation where maybe during a 5-year term, the Parliament was doing somewhere in the region of 15 to 25 implementation reports. It's now doing more between 45 and 60 during a 5 year. So it's gradually stepping up, and also putting commissioners and so on under a bit more pressure in parliamentary committee sessions on that front. On the first, I mean, I think that's a great idea, where we would try to put out at the end of each plenary session something which just doesn't describe what happened, which there are already quite a number of those communications, and they're interesting, but something which actually says what difference does that potentially make for the man or woman in the street, as we say in Britain. Klaus, I see you wanting to come in on this.
No, it's okay. Maybe just to confirm, Anthony, I think that's in fact where we made a lot of progress, especially with the Director for Impact Assessment. So let's say we've been haunting now for years poor civil servants in the European Parliament with a program called Completing the Legislative Cycle. So exactly not to lose sight of a dossier once it's passed, but go through the whole life cycle of a legislation and then make experience useful for once it is coming up for revision, and providing automatic reports basically for rapporteurs if they are doing amending legislation. I think that's one of the areas where Parliament has really progressed. And also in the President's reform process, which he has launched now and which is now coming to, I think, the decision phase, speaking time is one of the key things. So to go for at least much more than one minute speeches. I think none of those ideas, or very few, are really new, but it seems that after some attempts, some are linked to Dagmar Roth-Behrendt, other ones are linked to Swoboda. Now in the third time, we might be lucky in the sense that there is much more acceptance by political groups to also reorganize plenary in a way that it can be much better understood by ordinary citizens. We've also profited from the COVID crisis to now finally allow that members are speaking from the rostrum. So in fact, they're finally addressing to their peers, and you have the impression of other parliaments. We introduce this as a measure for hygiene, because if you're speaking from there, you have some meters of distance to the first people that, let's say, might be in the reach of your breath. But what was started as a measure for hygiene, I think, is becoming a measure for political hygiene, in making our debates more understandable and more in line also with practice on the national level.
Thank you. Coming towards the end of the session, which is slated to last, I think, for 75 minutes, I just wondered, David, if there's another section of the book that you would like to read out. I've got one very short one that I'm going to read, if I may, which I thought was particularly poignant. But I just wondered if there's another short section that you would like to read to give a flavour of the account which you're giving of those stirring times.
Yes, we can go back to Northern Ireland, which is such a topical issue at the moment. And we mentioned John Hume. Okay. The 8th of November, 1998. The Bureau of the Socialist Group is in Derry to support their fellow MEP John Hume in his hometown, and to see on the ground the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement signed in Belfast last April, and in which John played such a central part. Earlier today, we visited the newly opened Museum of Free Derry, which uses graphic film footage and photos to trace the development of the troubles and the suffering endured by the people of Derry over the years. This is where John made that quote I referred to earlier: "The trouble with the English is they never remember, trouble with the Irish is they never forget." Being here at this time, when at last there's hope for an end to the bloody conflict, gives me a sense of history, humility, and pride. For many years, the European Parliament was the only place where elected politicians from the different communities in Northern Ireland could speak freely together out of public view. The European Parliament's ethos of cross-party cooperation and informal networking helped to transcend the fundamental differences of opinion that divided John Hume and the two Unionist MEPs, Ian Paisley and John Taylor, on their home territory. Their work together, often at John's initiative, in the overall interest of the people of Ulster, also led to this political support and significant financial assistance provided by the Commission and the EU as a whole. Throughout this process, John could always count on the unqualified backing of the Socialist Group. Over time, the Brussels track of the peace process became increasingly influential in paving the way to a lasting resolution of the conflict. Tonight we meet for dinner with local representatives in the Guildhall. Mo Mowlam, UK Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, is seated at the top table between Pauline Green and John Hume. I'm placed at a table at the back of the room with Martin McGuinness, former leader of the Provisional IRA. Everyone knows who he is, but pretends not to notice him, while occasionally sneaking a glance in his direction. They're probably wondering how many deaths of British soldiers and loyalist paramilitaries he is directly responsible for. McGuinness looks faintly bored, but caustically amused. Conversation is perfectly friendly, but gives the impression that he's there on sufferance and would prefer to be somewhere else. I quickly decide there's probably not much point in trying to make small talk with Martin McGuinness. At the end of the well-lubricated dinner, the room falls quiet and the atmosphere becomes dewy-eyed and emotional when John Hume stands up to sing Danny Boy, his party piece. He sits down to thunderous applause. McGuinness, looking quite unmoved, calls over one of his bodyguards and they share a private joke. A few minutes later, he leaves without saying goodbye to anyone.
Thank you for that very powerful passage. And as somebody who was around in the European Parliament in the very early days post direct elections, I mean, I remember the important role which the Parliament in effect played as a place where people from different traditions could come together. I remember, for example, being really struck once in the dining room in Strasbourg, seeing John Hume, Ian Paisley and John Taylor, the three MEPs from Northern Ireland at that time, sitting together and having lunch. Something which would have been impossible in a British domestic political context. And really enabled a dialogue to take place behind the scenes, which wouldn't otherwise, and as you say, it was then extended more widely. David, this has been a great conversation. Thank you both to your good self and to Klaus for joining it. I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book, and I'm not actually a great fan of diaries, but I thought this was really terrific. And the passage that I would like to read, if I may, and if the audience will bear with me, is from the 10th of July 2008 in Strasbourg. Sarkozy addresses the European Parliament. A bundle of nerves in private, forever wiggling his right leg and sucking sweets. When speaking before a large crowd, Nicolas Sarkozy is a man transformed, instinctively knowing how to charm and disarm his audience, in turn measured and cajoling, emotional and dispassionate. Today in the European Parliament, launching the programme of the French presidency, he easily dominates the proceedings and neutralises his opponents with a combination of guile and faux naivete. And then continuing the alcoholic allusions that seem to pepper this book, he's a teetotaler, which means that after Chirac's 12-year tenure, and by the end of Sarkozy's mandate, the Élysée, which naturally boasts one of the finest wine cellars in the world, will have been occupied for 17 years by presidents who don't drink a drop of wine, Chirac's favourite tipple being beer, and in particular, Corona. And of course, the word Corona now has taken on a different significance historically, just showing you how when one writes one thing, it can come to have allusions to other. This has been a really great opportunity to not only go down memory lane, but to think a bit about the nature of European integration and the way in which it combines all these different forces, and more than anything else, how it is made by people. Without the men and women who make Europe and battle every day, whether it's ideologically or against forces that are anti-European, without that kind of effort and that commitment, and without the energy and the excitement and enjoyment that they bring to the process, nothing would have been achieved. Jean Monnet did famously say, if I'm not mistaken, that it's very well for men and women to build things, but without institutions, nothing lasts. But the human dimension, the human component, the human factor in this remains critical, and you have captured it, I think, beautifully in your book. So many congratulations on that. Thank you to David for sparing the time today to talk about how and why he wrote the book and to share some of its insights with us. Thank you very much, Klaus, for commenting on the book, and thank you to the almost 100 people who joined us online to share in these reflections. The next EPRS event will be in a couple of weeks' time. It'll be on Wednesday, the 29th of September. It's part of our series Thinking About the Future, and it's entitled How Will Artificial Intelligence Change Humanity? Exploring the social and political implications of our digital futures. So a slightly different tempo there. Ava Kiley, chair of the STOA panel, the panel for the future of science and technology, will introduce Vladimir Susha, who was the Director General of the JRC in the European Commission and has recently produced a landmark report on the implications for humanity of AI. And he will be joined by a roundtable of Heather Graby of the Open Society European Policy Institute, Andrea Renda from CEPS and the College of Europe, Anthony Gooch from the OECD in Paris, Laura Nursky from Bruegel, and that will be chaired by Marcus Schoren, who's the head of the Artificial Intelligence Special Committee unit here in the European Parliament. Look forward to seeing as many of you as possible online on Wednesday, the 29th of September. Thank you once again to everybody involved, and have a most agreeable and enjoyable afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.